Greetings, everyone. My name is William Porter. Welcome to this edition of Storytelling Time. Today's podcast is another interview session, and I'm very happy to have with us today Mr. Jimmy Davies, the president of Every Black Entrepreneur Podcasting Network. So great to have you, Jimmy.
Well, sure. Thanks for the invitation.
Good. Well, I know you've been involved in a lot of things.
That's an understatement.
The podcasting that we do every week and throughout the week, including my podcast, which airs on Saturday mornings. And but I believe, you have about 35 hosts?
About 30.
30 hosts?
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to, of course, keep all of us in line, and that's a chore. And not to mention all the seminars that you conduct most weeks, and I know every week probably you attend some kind of seminar, some kind of presentation. So you're in a lot. But what I'd like to know more about right now is what your early home life was like. And specifically, was there anything in your home life early on that influenced or even propelled you into doing what you're doing now?
Okay, well, we'll go back a few years, but I usually start off by telling people that my father was born in 1892, and that usually gets them like 1892, but he was 60 years old when I was born, and I was his first child. My sister's 3 years younger than me. Now my mom, she was about 22 years younger, but yeah, he was quite a bit older when I was born, so. We grew up in Flint, Michigan. Lived in Flint, Michigan. Really, we were poor, but I didn't know it because we never went for anything. Never saw a hungry day or never homeless or anything like that. But it really hit me how little my parents made when my father passed away, and I saw some of the income tax returns, and I wondered how in the world did they do it. One thing that we always did, we always had a big garden. Even though we lived in the city, my parents, they bought the lot next to us and always had a big garden, and we always had fresh vegetables and fruit. We had fruit trees, and I realized, later on that was a really big influence. Now I never knew any of my family from my father's side. His mother died in 1892, giving birth to him. And his father died by the time he was 2 years old. So he never knew his family. He was raised by an uncle who raised him in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Actually, he was born in Louisiana. And the story is that the uncle had a wife. And back at that time, apparently some guy, a white guy in Louisiana, decided to take the wife and chased them out of town. So the uncle took my father, and he had a first cousin, Robert, took them to Tulsa to raise them, and he snuck back to Louisiana and got his wife out, brought her to Tulsa also. Now my father, he and his cousin, they said that they ran off to join the service to fight in World War I. And after that, he lost track of his family. He never knew what happened to them. And, he passed away in 1979. But I realized years later that there was a big race riot in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. And so any family that he had would have been there at that time. And I'm sure that's why he lost track of them. He was never able to find his family. So I never knew anyone on my father's side. Now, my mother's side is a little different. I've got lots of family on my mother's side to kind of make up for it. And my mother was born in Little Rock, Arkansas, but they moved to Michigan during the 40s. I guess this was when a lot of families were moving from the south to the north through the migration to find good jobs. But I had a lot of first cousins. Because my parents were older in life when I was born, all of my first cousins were actually 15 to 20 years older than me. But they were great role models for me. And one of the things we always did every Sunday for years, we would always have a big family, extended family dinner. And so all the cousins would either come to our house or we'd go to their house. And we just did that for years. A big, have a great family get together. And I just remember my cousins and my aunt and uncles, they were really always aware of what was going on in the news. And some of my cousins were active in the civil rights movement as well. But I just remember being a child, like 8 or 9 years old, and I'm listening to all these stories, I'm listening to all the things that are going on. This is during the 60s. And I remember we'd sit around the TV and we'd sit around the TV and watch all the things going on in Alabama and Mississippi. And I always just wanted to be a part of that, listening to all the stories. But then, I've shared this with you before, but by the time I became of age, by the time I became 18, a young adult, then basically all the marching was done, and I always kind of felt left out.
Well, it's kind of interesting about the, you say the riots in 1921?
In Tulsa, Oklahoma.
In Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Right, it was 1921.
And I'm sure that someone probably, was it your father, that told you about some of those
Well, no, actually,
situations?
he didn't. He didn't, and that's why I said I really wish I had asked him more about it when he was living. He never really talked about it, other than he would say he lost track of his family. I don't know if he knew why he lost track of his family. Maybe he did, but he just never really talked about that a lot. But I just, like I say, years later, that's when I discovered about this big race riot. And I'm thinking, well, that's where his family was. No wonder he lost track of them. So.
Well, sometimes as children, at least back in those days, there's a limited amount of communication that goes on between, especially very young children and older adults.
Right.
And someone would have to be intentional as far as giving you that kind of information, like
Right.
your father would have given you, or you would have had to been intentional about seeking information like that. But if, like in my case, we just didn't ask grown-ups certain kinds of things unless they were willing to give us that information. So.
And I think also, I think you're right. I think also because, like I said, my father was 60 years old when I was born, so I was about 26 when he passed away. But even at that age, my thoughts weren't on, I wasn't thinking about asking more information, getting more information about the history of his life or his family. Whereas, years later, as I matured, then yeah, of course I thought about it then, but I just really realized later on that was, a resource that I kind of let slip away. I wish I'd talked to him more about it and asked more questions when I had a chance.
Yeah. But when you finally did become aware of this unrest in Tulsa, Oklahoma back then in 1921, did that have any influence on you desiring to know more about injustices as they may have taken place when you were growing up, especially in the 1960s?
Well, I don't know if that did in particular, but like I say, growing up in Michigan, we were just 50 miles from Detroit. We were there during the Detroit race riot in 67, 68. So I just remember vividly, I was old enough to remember those things that were going on in the news, and that's just something that we always talked about on those Sunday dinners. We were always talking about current events, especially during that time. So and I think that probably more so just made me aware and interested at a young age about those types of things.
The marches that we had in the 1960s, and you hit upon that briefly, that your cousins were like 15 to 20 years older than you were,
Mm-hmm.
and they were positioned to participate in the all the activities that went on, the marches, and of course there were riots as well,
Mm-hmm.
all across the country, especially you mentioned Detroit. And of course we have a mastermind meeting that you direct every Monday night, and you play a short video where you describe that you felt left out
Right.
the fact that you weren't able, because of your age, to participate in some of the marches that took place in during that time. Do you think that may have influenced what you're doing now as far as trying to deal with various injustices and inequalities that may have existed within the mid-1960s when those activities were ongoing during that period?
Yeah, I think that period of my life sowed the seeds, but it really wasn't the focus of my life most of my life. I think it took a while for me to really put all the pieces together. I knew that I wanted to do something, but I kind of put that on the back burner. You just going through life and working and family, that type of thing. But I think the older I got, the more I realized that and I mentioned this in the video, we overcome slavery and civil rights, but the more I realized that economic equality is the missing piece. And so that's when I started to think of how can I make a difference, especially as it turned out I ended up in the computer field, and how can I use the skills that I had learned to make a real difference. But it didn't happen. It wasn't clear overnight. It took time. It took a long time before I really began to focus in on, I guess, more when I started thinking about what is my legacy, Yeah. So when I started thinking about that, like, what do I want to leave? And that's when I really started zeroing in on what can I do to make a difference.
So I guess when all these marches and demonstrations and riots even that took place in the 1960s, you were younger. You said that you didn't participate.
Right.
And I'm sure you viewed all these things on television.
Right.
They definitely were on television at that time, because
Right.
I remember. But they still had a tremendous impact on you growing up, even though you weren't an active participant.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And you mentioned television. Actually, that's one of the things I kind of sidebar. I believe that the civil rights movement happened during the 60s because of television and radio, where people could see and hear. Like, we were in Michigan, and we can see things were going on the other side, or lower half of the country, and they were being transmitted around the world, actually, because everyone had, for the most part, had access to a TV or radio at that time.
Right. Well, in order to become more active in injustices and inequalities, things that were expressed within these riots and demonstrations and activities that were ongoing in the mid-19 and late 1960s, you had to get experience. And going to school was one thing, but having more experience is something else, as far as you being an active contributor to doing something about the situation at that time. And so I'm pointing to the experience you had before you graduated from high school, even though you were not a participant in these activities, that I get the feeling that you regret not being a part of.
Right.
But you did get a chance to, through a program that you mentioned to me about, to travel to overseas.
Right.
And how did that influence what your non-participation in some of these activities, civil rights activities, did not allow you to be a part of?
Well, to kind of explain the whole trip overseas, I lived in Kenya, East Africa, for about a year. When I was 16, I left when I was 16, came back when I was 17. And I also had the chance to travel through India and Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, going back through India, going back around that way. There was a school teacher that lived right across the street from us growing up, actually a white guy, and he was taking interest in a lot of the teenage boys in the neighborhood, myself included. And he'd take us like swimming, camping, and he got a job to teach in Kenya for a year. Well, actually, he was there for about 10 years. But he got a job to teach in Kenya, to teach Africans to become teachers. So they would bring the brightest Africans from their villages, and they would come to, it was called Igoji St. Lawrence Teachers Training College in Igoji, Kenya, and the Africans would come and they would prepare the Africans to go back to their villages to teach the children. And so the second year he was there, he asked me if I'd like to come spend a year with him. So it really wasn't any technical programs. I said, sure. So I actually lived there for a year, and we traveled all over East Africa and eventually around the world. But I think a couple of things that really happened from that, and again, I think these are just all the building blocks to today. That it didn't register with me at that time that this was going to lead to being creating an organization that is going to make a difference. But two things happened, I think, from the travels. Is one, when I got back, I took a lot of photos when I was over there of the wildlife, all types of things. Climbed Mount Kenya, photos of the Serengeti Plains, Mombasa and the Indian Ocean. I mean, all over. And when I got back, my mother had signed me up to speak at the church, to speak at her work, to speak at the school. I mean, I didn't have a choice. And so that really helped to develop my public speaking skills. It wasn't, just being put in that spot where she's like, my son's been to Africa. Like, she would sign me up to do that. The other thing that happened when I was over there is because we only had electricity for 4 hours a day, and there was no TV, no radio. We did a little farming, but I did a lot of reading because, like I said, there's no TV. It was just a different lifestyle. So I began to read a lot for the first time, really, in my life, to read just for the fun of reading and learning more about authors, and I really liked the autobiographies. And then coming back, helping develop my public speaking skills, because I was always asked to speak at this place or that, one place or another, to talk about my travels. So.
Well, that's great. That's great. Well, you definitely need that experience, or at least that experience, I'm sure, contributed to what you're doing now. And,
right.
And even though, again, you may have felt neglected for not being able to participate in some of those activities, but things tend to work out the way they're supposed to. Well, anyway, we're going to go ahead and take a break now, and we're going to come back. And when we come back, we're going to ask Jimmy about what college was like and some of his other travels, and how he started to think in terms of becoming an entrepreneur. So we'll be back in just 1 minute. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're talking with Mr. Jimmy Davies, the president of Every Black Entrepreneur Podcasting Network here in the Raleigh-Durham area. Jimmy, we talked about your trips abroad when we left, and I'm sure that gave you some invaluable experience. Let's talk now about the time when you finally did leave high school. And what was that like? Did you go directly into college? Or what was that situation like?
Well, the first year of college, I went to a branch of the University of Michigan in Flint, Michigan, so I actually lived at home. But my second year of college, by the time I was 19, my girlfriend and I, we made our first child, and so we got married. I was 19, she was 18. And so we went to school together. I transferred to Ferris State College up in northern Michigan. And I thought I wanted to be a land surveyor, surveying property. So I got my associate's degree after a couple of years, and I came out. And it was really a process where I would go to school for a while and then I'd come out and work. She'd go to school, come out and work. And so we just did that to help get ourselves through school. But after, I guess, going into my senior year, I realized I really didn't want to be a land surveyor. And so I went to my counselor. I just remember going to my counselor and asking, like, hey, I just need to graduate. What's the fastest way to graduate? So I had a lot of math at that time, being a surveyor, it takes a lot of math. And he said, well, you just taken the math program. So I said, well, sign me up. So I got into, actually my degree is in mathematics, applied mathematics, but simply because I was just trying to get out of school. I wasn't trying to become a mathematician. But something happened, though, during my senior year as well. I was just walking through the admin building one day, and one of the counselors stopped me and says, Jimmy, the Social Security Administration is going to be here to interview some students. I'd like for you to interview with them. And I remember saying, well, I'm not interested in working for the Social Security Administration. He goes, well, it'd be just good interview experience. And he said, if I don't provide students for them, they won't keep coming back. So I said, okay, I'll do the interview. Well, sure enough, they called me for a second interview. And after the second interview, they offered me a job with the Social Security Administration. So I worked for the federal government for about 6 years as an SSI claims representative. SSI is another part of Social Security that's for blind, disabled, and aged individuals. But I never really liked the job. So right out of school, like I said, I worked for the Social Security Administration for about 6 years. Hated it. Absolutely hated it. And that's when I started thinking about what can I do to have a business of my own. And I tried Amway. I sold hot dogs at the county fairs. What else did I do? I had several janitorial services. Actually, one janitorial service I put in a contract bid for the city of Mount Pleasant, Michigan. They were looking for taking bids. Got the job. Didn't have a bucket. Didn't have a mop. Didn't have a vacuum. But got my fraternity brothers. They would help me out, and we did that for about a year. And did the job. That was my first janitorial service. But I was doing that part-time as I'm still working for the Social Security Administration. But anyway, after about 6 years of being on the Social Security Administration, I decided I couldn't do it anymore. So that's when I left and started, actually got my real estate license. Didn't do much with that. But that was at the time as well. My ex and I, we had kind of helped each other go through school. She's a clinical psychologist now in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. But we kind of split there, and I came to Virginia to actually wanted to work with a real estate firm, and decided I didn't like that. Started another janitorial service, and this was in '87, fall of '87. A friend of mine showed me a Macintosh computer, and immediately I knew, okay, this is what I want to do. And so, beginning of January 20 of 1988, I started McMaster's Computer Training Service, providing training for anyone that had a Macintosh computer. But I tell people I had two problems. One, I still didn't have a computer at that time, and I didn't know how to use it. I just knew I wanted to get into this computer thing. So I started a business helping people, and I would buy the books and read the books, teach myself. And then I would work with their computers to teach them how to use the software. And that launched a whole series of events.
Would you say that would have been kind of a transition between you having a normal job, quote unquote, such as in the janitorial service that you had, or at least that was actually a first business that you had, right?
Actually, the janitorial service, the second janitorial service, we were doing that full time, and making money at it, making a living at it. But that's when I decided to transition it to computers.
Okay, and so I'm trying to piece together the time when you were working at a regular job, quote unquote, and the time when you went into business as a full-fledged activity, being an entrepreneur.
Yeah,
and the computer aspect was kind of go in between those two. Is that correct?
Sort of. Like I worked for the Social Security Administration for 6 years, and I was always trying these side jobs on the side. Right. But then after 6 years, that's when I left full-time. I started another janitorial service. I was working that full-time. And then when a friend showed me a computer, I left. I phased the janitorial out and got into computers full time, and that was January of 1988. I want to keep saying 20 because of a different decade or a different century. But in 1988, January 1988, when I got into computers full time, and I've been doing some version of that ever since.
Okay, and I guess as they say, the rest is history as far as your work in technology, and that's what you're doing now with the podcasting. Well, we're about out of time for this particular segment, and we certainly would like to thank Jimmy for being with us, and this will not be the end of our discussions with him. He'll be back next week, and Jimmy, next week I'd like for you to delve more into the reason, the fundamental reason why you've been a success in business and being an entrepreneur, and that relates to your faith, and we haven't really talked about that. And as you know, that's what this program is all about. It's inspirational, it's spiritually focused, biblically based kind of material that we talk about, at least from the standpoint of me being an author. That's what I write about, and it forms the basis of these podcasts. So we'll go ahead and do that next week, and I'm sure that our listening audience and viewing audience will be very interested in knowing that from you. Well, give everybody your contact information, and because I'm sure you probably will receive some emails or calls inquiring more about what you've talked about.
Sure. If anyone can reach me at Jimmy@every.black is the email address, JIMMY@every.black, and our website is www.every.black. That's www.every.black. And I also want to invite your listeners and viewers to tune in to our podcast at www.entrepreneurship.black, where we've got a number of shows, including your own, on the podcast. It airs daily. I guess the last thing, too, my phone number is 919-265-8045. That's 919-265-8045. Thank you.
Well, that's great. Well, I'd like to thank, as always, my listening audience. And just keep this in mind and remember that whatever you're going through, whether good or bad, there's always more. There's always more that's coming your way. So have a good day, have a good week, and we'll see you next week.